Welcome to another installment of the top 10 most submitted books into CGC. As a reminder, the data that we're going to look at in this video is a leading indicator of ultimately what will come to the market. And I say that because these data have been sent to me directly by the folks at CGC and is not yet available in the census itself. So in many ways, this is a leading indicator. Over the course of this video, we're going to count down the 10 most submitted comics that we have sent in to CGC for grading, and along the way, I will try to provide some commentary and context potentially for why these books are showing up on the list. And I can tell you, there has been some movement on this list. There are some books that have been moved out of the top 10. There have been several that have moved into the top 10. And there's also a healthy number of books from the 90s that are suddenly showing up in the top 10. And like I said, we're going to count it down and we're going to look at these books in detail. Before we get to the list, I want to acknowledge the sponsor of this video, hipcomic.com. This is a wonderful website and platform for buying and selling comics. In addition to regular comic sales and no reserve auctions every Monday and Tuesday, Hip Comic actually has a monthly signature auction that is focused on high grade and high dollar comics like The Brave and the Bold issue number 28, Fantastic Four 48, and giant size X-Men, just to name a few. This month's auction actually ends on August 26th, so make sure you click on the link in the description for more details. With that said, let's get to the list. Number 10 on the list is a new comic. It is a new comic and it's also a new comic to the list. And it is Star Wars: War of the Bounty Hunters Alpha issue number 1. This book is the first issue in a 5-part series that serves as a prelude to the War of the Bounty Hunters event. More importantly, this book is the first appearance of Doc Raygon. And while this book does have a first appearance in it, I do not think that that is why the book is on the list. I think it's on the list because of this gorgeous cover by Lee. He absolutely killed this cover. And as soon as I saw it, there was no doubt in my mind that this is an awesome cover, an awesome comic. And I feel that this is why people probably sent this book in. At present, there is 0 sales data for this book in Go Collect, so I'm uncertain if the value of this book will exceed the cost of grading. But as I mentioned, I don't think that that's why people sent this book in. I think they sent it in because they looked at it, they saw how awesome this cover was, and decided, like Amazing Spider-Man issue number 55, that they were going to send it in, get it graded, and keep it in their possession. Now, with that said, it will be interesting to see what the sales data looks like for this book moving forward, should it remain on the list. Number 9 on the list is Batman issue number 108. And this book is the first appearance of 2 characters, Miracle Molly and Squeak. But it's also the origin story of Peacekeeper 1, who we saw back in DC Future State Dark Detective issue number 1. Now, what strikes me as really odd as I talk about this book is the realization that despite the fact that Batman and Batman related characters dominate what DC puts out, we do not see a lot of Batman comics on this list. And we've been doing this list for several months, and I can tell you for a fact that there are not a lot of Batman books that show up. In the previous 9 months, we have only seen 4 Batman related comics break into the top 10. In this same time period, there were 3 months in which Batman or a Batman comic failed to even show up on the list, which includes the top 21 books submitted into CGC. And as you hear these stats, I'm honestly interested as to what you think. Why don't we see more Batman and Batman related comics on this list? Why aren't people submitting these books into CGC? If you have thoughts, be certain to leave those down in the comment section, because I'm honestly interested to hear what your thoughts are. Number 8 on the list is the first of several comics from the 90s that we're going to talk about on this list, and it is none other than Spawn issue number 1. Now, this book has been on the list for several months. Typically, this book is actually well outside of the top 10. It's normally somewhere around 16 to like 20. That normally is where Spawn issue number 1 actually sits, but for some reason or another, it has jumped into the 8th spot. And I think that we can probably credit that to Todd McFarlane. Todd does an amazing job of making noise in the marketplace and getting fans excited about Spawn. And he's been doing a lot of that with his whole Spawn's universe that he's been talking about for several months. And I honestly think that what Todd does shows up, and it really manifests itself in terms of the sales performance of not just his comics, but also his toys, both of which continue to exceed expectations. There are a lot of fans out there, a lot of Todd McFarlane fans out there, and they consistently show up for him. And again, I think that that is part of the reason why we are seeing Spawn issue number 1 move its way up the list. Again, it'll be exciting to kind of see what happens with this book into the future, whether we continue to see Spawn issue number 1 from the 90s stay on the list, and whether the new books that Todd McFarlane is rolling out and really big numbers, whether some of those books start to show up on the list as well. Number 7 on the list is Boom. Technically, it is Berserker issue number 1 from Boom Studios, but you get my point. This book, Berserker issue number 1, to no one's surprise, continues to be on the list month after month, and it has been since it was introduced in March of this year. In fact, this book has held the number 1 spot for the last 2 months, but was dethroned this month by another Boom book that we'll talk about in just a moment. Berserker issue number 1, and the Berserker title is one that people are still excited about. I think folks love Keanu Reeves. I think they enjoy the writer that is working with him on this book. They're enjoying the story, so it'll be interesting to see whether this book stays on the list, whether it leapfrogs back into the top 5, or whether it slides off the list. Only time will tell. Number 6 on the list is another book from the 90s, specifically SpiderMan issue number 1. And I think that it's actually the cover A that people are sending in, and I am hard pressed as to why that is the case. I really don't know. Outside of nostalgia, I don't know why people would send this book in. And not to say that nostalgia is a bad thing. I'm certainly not saying that. But when you look at the data, what you see, according to Go Collect, is that this book has an FMV of roughly $80, which again is not a ton of money, and it's selling for a little bit above that. Not a ton of money here, but there's something at play that is prompting people to send this book in. And maybe it's just, again, nostalgia, or maybe it's excitement from Todd McFarlane making a lot of noise out there in the market that is prompting people to actually send this book in. When you dig into the data, what you see is that there are almost 7,000 copies of this book on the census, with almost 5,000 of those copies sitting at a 9.8. This is not a hard book to put your hands on, not in any way, shape, or form, and it's certainly not a hard book to find in a really high grade. Number 5 on the list is another Spider-Man book, and another one from the 90s, but this one is Amazing Spider-Man issue number 361, the first appearance of Carnage. And this book is another that continues to flow into CGC month after month. At present, there are roughly 21,000 copies of this book in the database at CGC, with about 16,000 copies being graded at a 9.4 or higher. And despite those numbers, this book continues to have a strong performance. Its FMV at a 9.8 is around $1,050, and the book continues to sell right around that FMV. And potentially what's motivating people to send this book in is the potential for the Venom movie that is coming out, the sequel movie featuring Carnage. I think people are excited to see Carnage on the screen, and maybe they're betting that Carnage is going to get a spin-off movie. And after watching the trailer, I would say that anything is possible out there. Anything is possible because that trailer looked pretty good. And again, maybe that's what people are betting on. Time will tell. Number 4 on the list is a comic that features another Red character, specifically Omega Red, who first appeared in X-Men issue number 4 back in the 90s. And this book captured people's attention back in the day because of how well Omega Red matched up against Wolverine, but also because this comic was scripted and penciled by Jim Lee. This book is sort of interesting because when we look at the census data, there is a wide range of comics that are being graded. There is a range from 9.9 all the way down to 4.0. And for a modern comic that was heavily printed, I think that that is a pretty wide range. And it might speak to the fact that this character, this comic resonated with people back in the day, and people are continuing to send in their copies of this comic from back in the day, even if they were lower grade. Because if you look at a lot of modern keys, you don't necessarily see comics that are in the 4.0 range on the list. Yet, here we are with X-Men issue number 4 showing up on the list. When you dig into the data, what you see is that at present, 9.8s are selling below the Go Collect FMV of $350. The most recent sales for August for this comic have averaged around $275. This book was incredibly hot months ago and clearly has cooled off a little bit, but there are a lot of folks that still believe that Omega Red is going to appear in some way, shape, or form in the MCU. And I think that that's why we potentially are continuing to see this book submitted in to CGC. Now, it could be a few years before we actually see any magic happen because we first potentially have to get Wolverine before we can get Omega Red. So it could be a little while, and I have a feeling that we will potentially continue to see this book on the list because it was heavily printed back in the day. Number 3 on the list is another X-Men book. This one is X-Men issue number 1, volume 2. And I will be honest, I am hard pressed as to why this comic is on the list outside of nostalgia. And again, not to say that that's a bad thing, but there isn't a whole lot exciting that happens in this book. We get the first appearance of the red team and the blue team, and we get some bad guys, but nothing that would really warrant the type of submissions that would be needed for this book to appear on the list. And so again, I think that potentially it is nostalgia that is encouraging people to actually send this book in. This book was heavily printed to the tune of 8.1 million copies being sold back in the day. Sold copies. Now, mind you, those copies were spread across multiple covers, but it's still 8.1 million sold. A lot more were probably printed, especially in light of some of the things that we are learning of right now out there in the comic book community. But this comic, by and large, was a huge success. I will tell you that if you are thinking about buying this book, maybe not submitting your copy, but maybe buying this book, you may want to consider actually picking up the newsstand. I don't know how big the newsstand print run was back in the 90s, but my guess is that it was smaller than the print run for the direct comics. I actually have a full set of these comics in my collection that will be with my collection long term because I love the X-Men and I specifically love this run. But this might be a way, if you choose to participate, that you could get something that's maybe a little more special by getting a newsstand copy. And it actually took some time. I jumped online and I did spot a couple of newsstands on both eBay and also on hipcomic.com. So if you decide to go after them, there are two places where some of those books, the newsstands that is, are located. Number 2 on the list is no stranger to the list. It is Ultimate Fallout issue number 4, the first appearance of Miles Morales. And the data around this book is a little sketchy for me. Depending upon what reference you look at, I see different dates for the newsstand version and the direct version. And so because I'm seeing different dates for those two books, I'm unable to determine which copy is actually driving the submissions into CGC. But what I will tell you is that this book continues to flow into CGC, whether it be the newsstand or the direct. There are lots of copies that are showing up at CGC and are being graded. When you dig into the data, what you see is that in the database, the CGC database, there are roughly 10,700 copies of this book in the database. They do not, however, provide a breakdown of direct versus newsstand, but there are still a lot of copies. When you dig a little bit deeper, what you see is that there are roughly 3,000 copies at a 9.8 and an additional 3,000 copies at a 9.6. Going a little bit deeper, what we see in the sales data is that there have been 0 sales of a 9.8 newsstand. But the direct edition seems to have leveled out around an average sales price of $2,500 with 2 sales in August. This book was flying pretty high, north of $3,000 a few months ago. It looked like it was starting to come down and seems to have leveled off. Time will tell. Time will tell whether this book stays where it is or whether it goes up or goes down. We're certainly going to keep our eye on it. And it doesn't look like this book is coming off the list anytime soon. Like it is taking up like permanent residence on the list. And it's not a question of if it'll be on the list, it's more like where on the list will it be, because people are continuing to send copies in. Stay tuned. And finally, the number 1 book on the list is Something is Killing the Children, issue number 1, specifically the 8th print. This book was in 10th place last month and currently sits atop the list as the most submitted book into CGC. Last month, I wondered aloud as to whether this book was going to have any long-term value, and we sort of have an answer. When we look at the sales data in Go Collect, what we see is that there have been some sales of this 8th print and has a value at a 9.8 of roughly $107 for 4 sales recently. There are also just under 400 copies of this book on the census, with 362 of them coming in at a 9.8. If you happen to miss out on getting a free copy of this book, because it was a free comic, you can actually check both eBay and HipComic, because on both sites there are a ton of copies. Specifically on HipComic, I actually saw at least 2 graded books, both 9.8s, one from CGC and one from CBCS. So if you want to pick it up, it is certainly out there if you happen to have missed out. The bonus book for this month happens to be a comic from the 80s. And we don't see a ton of 80s comics on the list, but this one is really special. It is one of my favorite books and is tied potentially to the next major story arc that is going to be coming out in the MCU. At least those are some of the rumors that we are hearing about. And I am talking about none other than Marvel Superheroes Secret War issue number 8. This gorgeous comic is on the list in the 13th spot, and it might be there because of all the rumors that are flying around about this story arc made into an MCU movie in some way, shape, or form. And for those that don't know, this is the origin of the black costume that ultimately becomes Venom. And so Venom is having some success, Spider-Man is having some success, the MCU is having a lot of success in looking for their next story arc, and arguably Secret Wars was the biggest story arc of like the 80s, hands down the biggest story arc. And so it would make sense that they try to turn this into a movie or something like that. So time will tell whether that happens, certainly, and certainly time will tell whether this book is one that stays on the list or whether this is a momentary blip that we are actually seeing. With that said, I'm going to wrap this video up. I want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch. And if you haven't yet checked out the sponsor, be certain to click on the link down in the description. Head over to Hip Comic and check out some of the awesome stuff that they have available. And as always, if you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.